Hello and welcome to the JSA Studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan, and today I'm coming at you with our second video on the Ohio State Buckeyes. Today we will be discussing the defense, go position group by position group, and then talking about the expectations that we have for the team overall. Now, with the intro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's to ask you to like, comment, and subscribe. To start off with, we're going to start with the defensive line. The projected four starters along the defensive line are going to be Jack Sawyer, Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams, and JT Tuimoloau. One of the biggest concerns that I would have with this team would be the depth along the defensive line, because you basically have nobody outside of the starting four that has any real amount of playing experience. But you guys don't really rotate defensive linemen like that. Last year, you had 5 defensive linemen play more than 350 snaps, and no one else played more than 170. So you guys don't really rotate along the defensive line all that much, and whether or not you have depth there doesn't particularly matter because the starters are so good. The starting four are going to be elite caliber at the run stopping. Whether or not they can be good to great in pass rush is the actual question mark that I have with this defensive line. Because this past year, you really didn't have a whole lot of pass rush. You know, your best pass rusher was Michael Hall Jr. this past season. He's off to the NFL now. And even though Jack Sawyer played phenomenal this past season, played like a first-round pick, I do wonder who's going to step up along the interior of the defensive line in terms of getting that pass rush. I mean, Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton are okay pass rushers, but they are not the disruptors that Michael Hall Jr. was in any way, shape, or form. So even though I do think this is one of the best units in the country, I do have questions about how effective they're going to be at rushing the passer. I think ultimately this is going to be an elite run-stopping unit, and I think teams are going to have a hard time rushing against this defense in general, but specifically the defensive line, I think, is going to be able to handle 5, maybe even 6 blocking offensive players pretty easily. I just think that this is a very, very good run-stopping unit that does admittedly have a lot of upside as a pass rush unit. Maybe JT Tuimoloau can put it all together. He hasn't the past 3 years, but maybe he can put it all together this year. And worse comes to worse, Jack Sawyer, I believe, will ultimately end up in the top 20 sort of conversation for this upcoming draft class in terms of edge rushers. And JT Tuimoloau certainly has the athletic potential and physical skill set to end up in the first round discussion as well. He's not there right now, and it's going to take quite a bit for him to get there, but it is certainly a possibility. Ty Hamilton and Tyleik Williams are probably guys that are late day 2, early day 3 kind of players, in my opinion, but they could also take that next step forward and end up getting into that conversation as well. Moving on to the position where you have the most question marks, that would be the linebackers. Now, you do only start 2 linebackers who are, for the most part, a nickel defense in base, which means that you're likely only going to be starting 2 linebackers. This is the one where the depth might come more into play than the defensive line, because you've got 4 guys that have been healthy for the majority of their careers along the defensive line, and none of them have ever really had any long-standing injury concerns. And it's not that you have that at the linebacker position, but I'm not positive this group is going to be as good as it was last year. I was a big fan of the linebacking core last year for this team. Tommy Eichenberg and Steel Chambers were both players that I would higher on than the general consensus in the NFL draft. I liked both of them a lot. And moving on to the projected starters this year, which right now are Cody Simon and CJ Hicks. It's also very likely that Sonny Styles will rotate in the linebacking core. However, Sonny Styles, if he's going to play, needs to learn how to cover people for the linebacker position because, my God, he was not good at that last year. Also, I don't particularly know if this is the truth or not, but he is listed on the website that I'm using for just projected depth charts. He is listed as a linebacker, and I thought he was a safety last year, but if he was a safety, he was a box safety, so that's effectively a linebacker anyway. So I don't know, if you want to include him in the safety group, go for it, but he needs to learn how to play in coverage because he was really, really, really good at defending the run this past year. However, he was a liability in pass coverage to the point where you kind of had to hope that he wasn't actually covering anybody at any specific point in time. At least anybody that isn't a very slow-moving tight end. But he does have value in that role as a tight end matchup guy. I mean, it's not like he was that bad, but he was very clearly the guy that teams would look at and target if they had the ability to look at and target him, which the vast majority of your teams that you played last year did not have that ability. And to be honest with you, the vast majority of teams that you're going to play this year do not have that ability either. In fact, I would firmly state that only two do, Michigan and Oregon, and that's it. You have a very, very easy schedule this year, and I'm not going to hit you for that at all because it's exactly what I would do if I was like the athletic director for Ohio State. I'm not scheduling tough games because 10-2 in the Big Ten will get you into the playoff every single fucking year. So I see no reason to schedule out-of-conference tough games going forward. But that's just me. Anyway, moving back to the linebacker position, Cody Simon, I thought, played really well last year. He was kind of the third guy along with Steel Chambers and Tommy Eichenberg, played about half as many snaps as those two guys did. However, he did rotate in quite a bit. I do like him. I think he will be able to step up into a starting role. You guys also blitz your linebackers quite a bit. So I also think that in that role specifically as a blitzing linebacker, he's going to be a factor in potentially helping that defensive line out with the pass rush as well. So this is a defensive line that is good and a linebacking core that has a lot of question marks. However, I think the linebacking core is actually suited to help the defensive line at the aspect of the game where I think the defensive line might struggle. And this is a defensive line that I think is positioned well to help the linebackers with perhaps the aspect of the game that I have a little bit more question marks about them at, which would be the run defensive aspect from the linebacker position. So, in other words, your weaknesses don't overlap. And when weaknesses overlap, that's when you start seeing teams being able to exploit certain areas of the defense and start getting consistent success doing stuff. For example, this past season, your really only weakness was up the middle in pass coverage. Your safeties weren't great, but the linebacking core was also kind of not great in pass coverage. Cody Simon, I thought, was okay. Steel Chambers, I actually thought was quite good. And Tommy Eichenberg, even though I liked him a lot, was not very good at covering people, especially in a man-to-man situation, which is why you ended up blitzing him almost twice as much as any other linebacker. But to get back to the point I was trying to make, when you guys gave up big plays, it was teams attacking the level in the middle of the field between the linebackers and the safeties, because the safeties weren't great and the linebackers also weren't elite by any stretch of the imagination. This year, I don't think you're going to have that problem really at all. I think there is a definitive possibility the front seven, at least, is as good or potentially maybe even better than it was this past season. And it was probably the second best unit in college football. The final position group here is going to be the secondary. And this is unquestionably, in my opinion, the best secondary in the country. I don't really think there is anybody that can come close to how good this secondary is going to be this year. Caleb Downs is arguably a top maybe 5 player in all of college football. Denzel Burke is getting what I believe to be unwarranted first-round hype, but he is still someone who I would probably have graded if he had come out this past year as like a top 50 player, so just outside of the first round. Jordan Hancock in the slot was a very good player for you this past season. Davison Igbinosun was a quality starting corner. I think he was good, maybe above average to good, sort of in that range. However, I do believe that he is someone that can very easily improve, because where he actually struggled for the most part was in coverage, because he was actually a phenomenal run defender. So if he can sort of chill out a little bit, he got a little antsy in coverage sometimes. If he can sort of chill out a little bit, then he's got the potential to be a elite caliber corner at the college level. Latham Ransom at the strong safety position is probably the weakest link in terms of the starting players on this defense, but I don't think he's bad by any stretch of the imagination. I think he's a quality starting strong safety for a Power 5 team. I think he's a good player. Like, he's okay. You know what I mean? And Caleb Downs, again, I think he's unquestionably the best safety in the country. He might be a top 5 defensive player in the country. He might be a top 5 player regardless of offense or defense or position in the country. He is that good. He will be a top maybe 5 even pick 2 drafts from now, but probably a top 10 lock. And guess what? Safety play was your biggest problem the past 3 seasons. 2021, the defense was just bad as a whole. But in 2022, it was the safeties that really let you down. The front 7 was actually really, really good. And the outside corner play was, well, it was I would say, okay. But Denzel Burke was really, really good, and then you didn't really have anybody else other than him. And then this past season, everything was good to elite except for the safeties. They were, I would say, average, maybe even kind of below average. But that is no longer the case. This is an elite secondary unit, and with the addition of Caleb Downs, a elite safety group. I mean, it just is at this point. He's a very, very, very good football player, and the overall chemistry of this unit, it all works together very well. Even though there are shortcomings here or there, they are very likely to be masked by the fact that other players on the field are just good enough to mask the inconsistencies or shortcomings of other positions. This is a unit that I think unquestionably heading into the season is the best defensive unit, and I think there's a very real possibility that this is just the best defense in college football. I mean, Michigan is in that conversation. Alabama's in that conversation. Georgia's going to be in the conversation. Florida State, based off of what we saw last year, and yes, they lost a whole lot, but I believe in that program. I think Florida State might be in that conversation. Clemson, probably not, but I got a whole thing with Clemson that I don't need to get into with this video. All in all, this is an elite secondary and an elite defense that worst case scenario is still probably a top 5 defense in college football. So what are the expectations for this team this season? And the expectations for me are incredibly simple. The expectation is a 13-0 regular season and a national championship. This is a team that, if not for an SEC biased, would be the consensus number 1 team in the country, I think. Now, do I think they're the number 1 team in the country? No. But I don't think Georgia is the number 1 team in the country either. And just to stave off other things and questions that people might have. It's not Michigan either. The Michigan's probably not even in the top 8. I will talk about it at some point in terms of who I think the number 1 team in the country is, but for now, we're going to focus in on this team because the expectations for this team are sky high. And at Ohio State, the expectations are always high, except for they're not really always this high, okay? The fact of the matter is, Ryan Day has not accomplished as much as your previous 2 coaches, especially within the first 3 or 4 years of them existing. In Jim Trustle's second season as the head coach, he won the national championship. In Urban Meyer's third season, he won the national championship. However, Urban Meyer, also in 2012, didn't have a team eligible to play for the national championship, and I believe they probably would have won it in 2012. As great as that Alabama team was, they didn't play Braxton Miller on offense, and that motherfucker was that guy. All that being said, putting all this aside, Ryan Day hasn't been a bad coach by any means, but the expectations at Ohio State are you should be winning national titles and competing consistently for them. And again, we can go back to 2020. Everybody knew Ohio State was a lamb going into slaughter, heading into that Alabama game. Or at least I did. That Alabama 2020 team, for my money, is the greatest college football team of all time. Yes, ahead of 2019 LSU. Because the 2020 Alabama actually had an ability and a capacity to play defense at a high level, which is not something that 2019 LSU had. However, that was probably not even his best chance to win a national title. Because in 2022, if you had a kicker that could make a kick at the end of a game, then you probably win that game. If it goes to overtime, you probably beat Georgia and you win the national championship. So he's been close a couple of times. He's made the national championship, and he's gone to a point where he probably should have won a national championship, even though he didn't actually make the national championship game. So he's been close, but there are plenty of coaches that have been close several times. Lincoln Riley has been close several times, and Lincoln Riley practically got ran out of Oklahoma. I know that that's not the narrative that the media wants to say about Lincoln Riley. They say that he went to USC because, whatever, money or the allure of making USC a relevant program again, which he hasn't done. But if you look from a national perspective about how people talk about Ryan Day and how people talk about Lincoln Riley, there's a clear difference. People talk about Lincoln Riley like he's a top 3 coach in college football. People don't talk about Ryan Day like that. Now, most people would put him in the top 5, but there are seriously people that are questioning whether or not he is an elite coach and whether or not he will even last past this season if he loses to Michigan again. Now, that's ultimately not for me to decide. I'm not an Ohio State fan, but I think he would be clinically insane to fire him. Just because these past few seasons, Michigan has been better teams than you. Because, again, each of the past 3 seasons, Michigan has been a better team than you. It was not fluke. It was not luck. It was Michigan was flat out and straight up better than you all 3 of those years. So I guess the major question that I would have for you guys is if you end up 10-2, which is your floor, you're going to beat everybody on your schedule that isn't Oregon and Michigan. And I think you've got a very, very, very good chance to beat Michigan this year. Oregon, I actually think, just off of paper and what I'm expecting that team to be, is actually a bad matchup for you. But you can certainly win that game. But even if you lose those 2 games, and they're not blowouts, which I don't think they will be. I think your defense is too good for them to be blowouts. But if you lose those games in a close matter, you're 10-2 and you're still probably going to be ranked in the top 7. So there is a nigh impossible amount of shit that would have to go wrong for you to not make the playoffs this year. And generally speaking, especially in the expanded playoff field, that should be the bare minimum expectations for Ohio State every single year, should be to make the playoffs. And that's like a bare minimum. If you don't make the playoffs, you're probably getting fired because you're incompetent. But I guess one of the questions that I would posit to you, Ohio State fan listening to this video, would be, what if you do lose to Michigan for a fourth straight year and Ryan Day is now 1-4 against Michigan? I don't know what you would do, because on one hand, I think you'd be crazy to fire Ryan Day. But on another hand, if the roles were reversed and it was Michigan who was being this team that could beat everybody except for Ohio State, which is not what they were before they turned it around in 2021, because they lost to Penn State, they lost to Michigan State, they lost to Wisconsin, they lost to basically everybody except the genuinely bad teams on their schedule. So if these roles were reversed, would I be happy with the Ryan Day experience at Michigan in terms of, we're winning 11, 12 games every year. Yeah, we can't beat our rival, but we're still making the playoffs. We were very close to a national title twice. Could I live with that? And the answer to that question is fucking maybe. I don't know, because I grew up never having Michigan beaten Ohio State, so it probably just would have been par for the course. But if we flip that around too, where Michigan was always beating Ohio State growing up, I don't think I would. I don't think I would stand for it. I think I would take maybe knocking myself down a peg into not being a national champion every year to consistently beating Michigan. I think that's probably what I would try to do. But again, that's not for me to decide. I think it's very unlikely that Ryan Day is fired unless he flat out and straight up loses to teams that he has no business losing to, which I don't think is very likely to happen. But if you end up worse than 10-2, you might have to have some serious conversations about Ryan Day getting fired, because that would take an unbelievable amount of incompetence on the coaching side for something like that to happen. Because you guys could come in and play a C- game in every single game this year and end up 10-2. So you're going to have to be dipping into D/F territory in order to end up worse than 10-2. All that being said, I think there's a significant possibility that you end up playing Oregon again in the Big Ten championship game. That's what I would predict right now. I haven't gone in depth on all of the Big Ten teams, but that's what I would predict right now would be Ohio State versus Oregon in a rematch between a 12-0 and an 11-1 team. And whoever the 11-1 team was, I would then pick them to win the rematch, because generally speaking, teams that lost the first time end up winning the second time. So maybe you want to lose during the regular season, then you win the Big Ten. I don't know. But that is a realistic expectation, I think, is 12-1 or 13-0. If you're 13-0, you're probably going to be the 1 or the 2 seed. I think it's likely Georgia takes a loss at some point this year. They're playing like 5 really quality teams this year. So I think there's a possibility that Georgia ends up taking a loss. So if you go 13-0, there's a very good chance you're the number 1 overall seed. And that's what the expectation for me is. And is the expectation lofty? Yes. Is it unachievable? No. Would you have to bring your A game in the important games in order to see it happen? Yes. Can you do that with only 2, maybe 3 games if you count the Big Ten championship game, important games on your schedule this year? Is that absolutely achievable? Yes. Yes, it is. You could very easily do that. So why don't you go ahead and let me know what you think this season is going to look like and what your expectations for this team is. It could be 13-0, it could be 12-1, win the Big Ten still. It could be as long as you beat Michigan. It could be make the playoffs and win a game. It could be whatever you want it to be. So why don't you go ahead and let me know in the comment section what your expectations for this season are, because I've given you mine. But after all, I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. And it's at this point in the video that I would like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with any point or you just have something to say, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comments section below. And now with the outro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's I'll see you next time.